Hey everyone, it is Friday, January 17th, 2025, and it's time for another update on the 50-meter beer project. So in the last video, I showed you how I made lager malt, which I have to say was a real pleasure to make. It's probably the easiest malt I've ever made in my entire life. You literally hydrate it. In my case, I let it germinate on the floor, and it requires such low temperature for the drying and kilning steps that I could just do the whole thing in a food hydrator. I didn't need to pull out the kitchen oven to get a nice toast on it or anything like that. So since then, I have made a second batch of malt, which will be the second of the two malts going into this year's beer. But this one was more of a Caramunich malt. So this one's kind of the polar opposite of the lager malt, whereas the lager malt is about as easy can be. This Caramunich type malt is about as difficult as it can be. So I made about 1 kilo of this malt, and the process has some parallels with making lager malt because, of course, most malting shares at least the early stages. But once you get to the germination stage, things kind of go off the rail with this malt. So the first step is, of course, to soak this thing in water in order to hydrate it to around 46 to even as high as 48%. You want a lot of moisture in this grain because we are going to really kind of push the enzyme package in this grain hard, and it needs a lot of moisture to get through all of that. So that took me, I think, 3 12-hour soaks plus another 8 or so hour final soak before I hit roughly that moisture level. Just like with the lager malt, I germinated this on the floor. I bought a very thin food-grade plastic tarp from a kitchen supply store because I think my floor has lead in the paint on the floor. And so that was obviously there to protect it. And, you know, I found with the lager malt that that was an accidental, really smart thing to do, not just because of the lead paint issue, but because it made turning the malt really easy. You literally just pick up the tarp, and the malt would kind of roll over and turn itself. Then you smooth it back out, and the malt was turned. So I took advantage of that system to malt the second batch here. And even though it was 1 kilo, so a pretty small amount, it worked really well. Germination was nice and slow and controlled. But I did run into a problem, and I sort of knew this with the first batch of malt, and it was really apparent in the second batch of malt. And that was, I probably shouldn't have cheaped out and bought such a thin piece of plastic. The thing I got was 3 by 4 meters, so roughly 9 by 12 feet. It was paper thin plastic. I'm not entirely sure what the food industry uses that for, why they would need such a huge piece of food grade plastic. I don't know. But the thing was like $5. So you can imagine how thin that plastic is. And so there's 2 downsides to that. The first, of course, is it was very easy for me to put holes in it if I wasn't paying attention to what I was doing. Not so much with the Munich malt, but with the lager malt, I had 4 or 4.5 kilos of that, and the weight of that was enough. If I wasn't careful, my fingers would poke through the plastic. But the plastic was actually so thin that the roots of the germinating barley would get in and penetrate through the plastic. So this thing, after 2 batches of malt, looks like I took a shotgun of bird shot to it. Just full of these tiny little holes from all the little rootlets poking through the plastic. So unfortunately, I can't use it again. It's too damaged. So I'm going to definitely use floor malting in the future. It is so much easier than trying to do it in buckets or baskets. But I'm going to go and spend a little bit more and a little bit better quality of a food grade plastic thing so that I can maybe use it more than once. The other nice thing, though, with the floor malting approach is I can malt a lot more than I could before. I had a couple of Rubbermaid style containers that I used for the germination step previously, and that limited me to maybe 5 kilos of malt in one go. I haven't pushed the floor malting system at all, but it was trivial to manage that 4.5-ish kilos of lager malt, and I had tons of space left. I could probably do 20 kilos, which would be close to 50 pounds in one go if I really, really wanted to. So minus the thin plastic, that floor malting approach was fantastic and definitely the way I'm going to do this moving forward. So as it's malting on the floor, of course, the rootlets are coming out, and that Acrospire, the beginnings of the leaf, are starting to grow underneath the barley kernel. Now for lager malt, we wanted that Acrospire to grow to about 75% the length of the barley. The rationale there being is you don't want to generate too much enzyme for lager malt. It's sort of a lower a lower enzyme package in that malt. And so by stopping the malting process there, or the germination process there, you sort of limit the degree of modification of the malt. Well, for this Munich malt, it's the exact opposite. We want a highly modified malt with a really potent and powerful enzyme package. And so to get to that stage, we let it germinate to 100% to maybe even a little bit past 100%. So that means that Acrospire is the full length of the grain and maybe even starting to poke out and get a little bit past the end. And so that actually went fairly quick. I think it was 4.5 or 5 days from when I pulled it from the water to when the Acrospires were at that length, which actually in some ways isn't ideal. You do want that process to go a little bit more slow. It just gives a little bit more time for the enzymes to develop, but that's the timing that I hit on, so that's where I ended up moving on to the next step. Now, everything up to that point, other than the amount of moisture I put into the grain and the length of the Acrospire, was identical to the lager malt. But this is where things really start to change, and this is where making these kinds of malt become a lot more challenging than with making a conventional lager malt or even a pale ale malt, something like that. And the reason is what we're going to do now is instead of drying this out and turning it into malt, we're actually going to try and activate that enzyme package. And essentially, we're going to mash inside of the grain. Now, if this was a straight crystal malt, the way you would do that is you would warm it up to somewhere between 65 and 70 degrees Celsius, so conventional mashing temperatures, so the amylases could convert the starches into sugar. And that's the first step in making crystal malt. But here I wanted a caramunich-style malt. And so before we get to that crystallization stage, or the saccharification stage, we need to do an earlier stage, which is more of a protease and Maillard reaction stage. So this requires us to keep the moisture in the malt, but we don't want to add a bunch of extra water because we don't want any of that goodness to come out. We want it to stay inside of the grain. And so the way I tried to do it this year, and it worked fairly well, is I actually vac packed the grain into a vacuum sealer bag and then used a souse vide to manage my temperature changes. And this really, really worked well, except for one minor problem, and that is during the initial sort of warming of the grain goes through sort of a hyper-germination and a hyper metabolic state because it's getting warmed up, metabolism speed increases. So the bag did inflate over the first about hour of this protease and saccharification process. So I did have to poke a hole in the bag, push out the air, and reseal it once. But once we got past that initial burst of metabolism, everything was flawless. The advantage of using the souse vide is, one, temperature control is spot on. Two, we don't have to worry about the grain drying out as this sort of mashing process is going. And thirdly, the temperature changes are much quicker. So in the past, I've done this in my food hydrator, and you kind of wrap things in foil to try and keep everything contained. And because you're trying to use warm air to heat up the grain, it can take hours just to get the grain to the temperature that you want. In the case of the souse vide, it took about 20 minutes from the time when I put the grain in the water to when it was at the correct internal temperature. So much faster. Obviously, though, limited. In my case, I don't think I could do more than 1 kilo without investing in a much larger souse vide container. But if you're doing smaller amounts, a really good way to do it. So anyways, the first step, like I said, is that protease step. And what we're trying to do there is develop some enzymes, but we're also trying to get some protease activity to start breaking down and freeing up some amino acids. And the reason why we want that is those amino acids will react with sugars to form Maillard products. So these are those raisiny, biscuity flavors that you associate with Munich malt and Caramunich malt. And it's the development of those flavors that makes something like a Caramunich malt different from a straight crystal malt, where you sort of skip that step and go straight to making sugars and then caramelizing the sugars. So for that protease rest, I heated, let me check my notes, to 50 Celsius, which is 122 Fahrenheit, and I held it there for 6 hours. Now, if you were making Munich malt, that would be closer to 8 to 12 hours because that's basically your sole flavor generating step. But in my case, I needed to preserve some enzymes because I then wanted to go on to sort of the crystallization step, the first part of which is warming that grain up to 70 Celsius, which is 158 Fahrenheit. for another 4 hours. And during that time, the amylases in the grain will break down the starches into sugar, giving us essentially grain that's been mashed inside of the kernel. Now, this process didn't work quite as well as it did in some of my previous test batches. And I think the reason for that is in my previous test batches, that initial protease stage I only did for 2 to 4 hours. And I wanted a little bit more of that sort of Munich character. That's why I extended it out. But I think I may have broken down too much protein and actually destroyed some of my amylases. So that was maybe not the best decision. But the saccharification step did work fairly well. So when I eat a piece of the grain, it was sweet. It's just there was still quite a bit of starch left on the inside. Normally at the end of that saccharification step, if you squish the grain, it's basically syrup on the inside of the grain. And this instead was kind of like a sticky mixture of sugar and starch. So a little underconverted compared to what I was hoping to get to, but still converted enough that it is pushing more into that Caramunich range than into just sort of a straight Munich malt. So once all of that's done, the next step is we want to dry down that grain to lock in the sugar. We don't want that sugar to sort of escape and run off the grain. And at this point, because we've essentially destroyed or used up most of our enzyme activity, and because we're then going to caramelize the sugars after, which will finish off any other enzymes, we can be a lot more sort of rough in how we dry out the grain. It's not like when we're drying a Pilsner malt where you're trying to preserve enzymes and you have to go very slow and very gentle. For this, it was just straight into the food dehydrator, 70 Celsius, which is 158 Fahrenheit, for it was roughly 3 hours until it was pretty much dried out. So we're really just kind of hitting it with a bunch of heat, drying it out. At that temperature, we're going to get some more Maillard reactions and develop some more flavors. But we're not really into the sugar caramelization temperatures yet. Once that malt is dry, and I think, I didn't measure it, but it should be roughly around 3% moisture at that point, we then transferred it into a tray in the oven. And this is where we're really going to caramelize and darken those sugars to get those crystal malt type notes, the sweetness and the caramel flavors. So for the caramelization process, there's actually 2 temperatures. So we start off at a lower temperature, 107 Celsius, which is 225 Fahrenheit, for about 3 hours. And what we're doing there is we're doing sort of initial caramelization of the sugar. We're maybe pushing out any last residual moisture. We're driving some of those Maillard reactions. So really working on some flavor development. But we're trying to avoid producing any sort of caramelization flavors, which occurs when sugars actually start to break down into smaller molecules. After those 3 hours, we increase the temperature to 120 Celsius, which is 250 Fahrenheit. And this is what's really going to sort of push the darkening of the grain, start breaking down some of those sugars into those more caramel flavors. And this I only did for an hour, because at that point I hit what I was guessing was roughly 60 lava bond in color. And the way I determined that is I literally just cut my kernels in half with a knife and I compared them to a 60 lava bond crystal malt that I had. And they were roughly the same color at that point, at which point I brought them out of the oven and just let them sit and cool at room temperature until they were cool enough to package. Now, when I say package, they're not really packaged. They're just sitting in a bucket. I'll show you a close-up of those in a second. And the reason why they're just sitting in a bucket is the final toasting stage of this process, while it generates a lot of flavors we want, it also generates a lot of really unpleasant flavors. But luckily, those are volatile, and they will off-gas from the grain over time. And so you'll notice if you make your own malt in this fashion, when it comes out of the oven, you can smell those crystal notes, and you can smell those raisin notes and all of those things that we're looking for. But there is also a very harsh, borderline chemically smell to it. To me, it smells kind of like stale grain that's been left out in the sun. If you've grown up or lived on a farm, you know what that smell is like. It's not nice. And that is really what we're waiting to dissipate over time. And so, it's been about a week since I finished this. And that aroma, I would say, is 80% finished or gone. But there's still a bit of that left. So it's not quite there yet. So obviously, once that aroma is gone, this grain will be ready. The Pilsner malt or the lager malt is basically ready, except I still haven't knocked the rootlets off of it. I'm a little behind schedule on some of this stuff because we built a hockey rink out in the yard, and it turns out I'd rather spend my time dominating a 10-year-old on the ice than working on my brewing project. Strange things, I guess, as you get older. But anyways, I thought I'd give you a closer up of what this malt here looks like. I don't know how well this is going to show up on camera, but hopefully you can see there it's got a nice toasty color to it. The kernels are a little variable in color. That's just from in the oven. The stuff that's at the very bottom against the glass darkens a little bit more. But overall, a pretty nice crystal malt. And if I taste a bit of it, it's got caramelly notes. It's got toasty note. You get figs, real strong fig flavor. So I did achieve my Caramunich-style malt. Really delicious. But still with that little bit of a harsh edge. So it's not quite ready for brew day. But I'm hoping next weekend, maybe the weekend after, if I really have to, this stuff should be ready to roll. So I'm essentially ready for brew day, except for two things. One is, while I have my yeast in the fridge, I've got a few milliliters of yeast in the fridge. So I still need to run it through a yeast starter to get enough yeast growing up. And the other thing that I still need to do was arguably the most important thing that I need to do, and I have been putting it off because, again, hockey. But I really, really, really do need to do a conversion test with the lager malt to make sure the stuff actually is functional malt. Because, of course, if it doesn't self-convert, then it has no chance of converting along with this malt here that I just made, at which point I can't make beer. Luckily, it's a simple workaround. If I have to, I have some pretty high enzyme, just pale ale malt over in my brewery, and I can add a little bit of that to make sure there's enough enzymes there to convert. But last year the malt that I made from this barley was incredibly potent in its enzymatic activity, so I have high hopes that my malt this year will be equally active. So anyways, that's it for this video. It's a quick update, but we've got 2 malts made. We've got yeast almost ready to roll. We've got hops harvested. I just got to confirm my malt works, and I just got to grow that yeast up to a larger volume, and we should be ready for brew day. And really the only thing sort of holding us back is doing that conversion test on the other malt. And I maybe need to stop playing hockey for a night or two to actually get some other things finished. But until then, thanks for joining me, and we'll see you in the next video.